Our first speaker for today is Marisa Considine, who is a philosophy and theater double major here at Rowan. She'll present her original research entitled Potential Generations and Our Duties to Them.
So as Dr. Miller said, this is my presentation, Future Generations and Our Duties to Them. So, in 2013, a court case, Juliana versus the United States, brought future generations and duties to future generations to the forefront of the law. The lawsuit alleged that U.S. policy violated the right of future generations to a safe climate. This lawsuit brings up many questions, one of which is the question of duty to future generations. As you can see from the timeline, policy decisions that affect people today were made long before they were born, and current decisions made today will affect people who have yet to be born. So there are a few questions that this case presents. First of all, can people who do not yet exist have rights? Can currently existing people have duties towards people who do not exist? And finally, did the U.S. government do something wrong? Did the U.S. government violate the rights of future people by not taking their lives into account when making policy decisions? In this presentation, I will explore how it can be shown that future generations do have rights and current generations' duties to them by showing how it is possible to establish rights for future people and get around the fact that they do not exist. The first thing we need to establish is whether it is at all possible for future people to have rights. If future people can't even begin to have the necessary conditions to be a thing with rights, then there is no reason to believe that they do have rights. Furthermore, if future people do not have rights, then do currently living people still have duties to them? After all, duties often exist because other human beings have rights. People are obligated to not kill, for example, because other people have a right to life. So what is necessary for being a rights holder? According to Joel Feinberg, a rights holder must have interests. An interest being some sort of desire or aim that can be harmed or benefited by others. Interests that others must be capable of affecting. Rights holders must also be capable of having their interests represented by currently living human beings, even if they themselves are incapable of representing themselves in a court of law. So babies, people in vegetative states, and animals are all examples of beings who fit this description of a right holder. Along with them, future people can also be said to have rights, as we can know that future generations will have interests in food, water, shelter, etc., those sorts of things that people have today. Furthermore, current people are capable of affecting the ability of future people to achieve or gain their interests, and these interests can be and have been represented by currently living human beings. Although it seems that future people might have rights and current duties to them, Derek Parfay's non-identity problem poses a challenge to this idea. So, what even is the non-identity problem and how does it work? First of all, the non-identity problem focuses on the idea that one cannot be harmed by that which is necessary for one's existence. It works following the logic provided by some true facts about conception. If the specific sperm and egg that make you up never came together, you would have never developed. If one's parents did not manage to conceive them within the month they were in fact conceived, then they would have never existed. Certain actions that could be as large as U.S. policy decisions or as small as one parent needing to stop on Starbucks on a Wednesday are necessary sometimes for one's birth. It is these necessary actions that are key for the non-identity problem. I'm going to show how these different aspects come together through an example. So let's imagine a woman, Kelly. Kelly decides that she wants a child, but not just any child. Kelly decides that for whatever reason, she wants a child that will constantly be in pain. So Kelly walks down to her local genetic engineering center to engineer a baby that will fit her specifications. The process is successful, and in a few months she gives birth to Dylan, a baby that is indeed constantly in pain. Now, most people will say that Kelly has done something wrong. Why? Well, most people will say that Kelly has done something wrong because by creating a child that knows only pain, she has harmed her baby. She has made her baby less well off than it could have otherwise been. In fact, that's what Kelly's mom tells her. However, Kelly knows that despite the pain, Dylan has a life worth living. Furthermore, she knows that she hasn't harmed Dylan, as she hasn't made him any less worse off. If she had decided not to genetically engineer Dylan, she wouldn't have given birth to a Dylan without pain. She would have instead given birth to a completely different, healthy child, Devin. Since Dylan cannot exist without his genetic engineering, Dylan has not been harmed by Kelly, and she hasn't done anything wrong by creating him. It's important to remember that although Kelly could have given birth to a healthy child, that is irrelevant. The issue is, has Kelly wronged or harmed Dylan? Harm cannot be measured by comparing the welfare of one person against the welfare of a completely different person. In order to see if Dylan has been harmed or made worse off by Kelly's actions, his potential well-being must be compared to his current well-being, and Dylan is not the same person as Devin. This is a relevant issue for future generations as, like Dylan, there are some actions necessary for their existence. Big issues such as U.S. policy on global warming, dropping a nuclear bomb, or other generations have the ability to affect the identity of future people in future generations. Replace Kelly with past generations, replace Dylan with future generations negatively affected by current choices, and Devin with future generations whose interests have been positively impacted, and you have the same situation. A group of people so impacted by past decisions that it changes their entire identity. And although one group is better off than the other, the less well-off group has not been harmed. It's the same situation. The non-identity problem outlines a few issues for establishing rights to future generations. Namely, one cannot be harmed by that which is a necessary condition for one's own existence. This calls into question if future people can truly be said to have rights and current generations' duties in line with those rights. Although Feinberg establishes that a being can have rights by way of interest, the non-identity problem points out the fact that acting against those interests are sometimes necessary for one's existence. If the outcome of an action only changes the identity of future people and harms no one, why should people believe that they have duty to any future people? There's no specific individual who's the holder of these so-called rights and interests. Arguably, existence is better than non-existence, and the outcome doesn't seem to matter if no one is made worse off, and everyone stays the same number of people. So one way to get around this is the de dicto de re distinction presented by Caspar Hare. Basically, the de dicto de re distinction targets the idea that in order for an action to be bad or wrong, it must be bad for some specific individual. Instead, this distinction helps to outline the idea that an action can be wrong regardless of whether someone was actually harmed or not. Hare basically explains that there are two ways by which someone can think of something: de dicto and de re. De dicto refers to categories of people, whilst de re refers to specific people who fall under those categories. The de dicto de re distinction helps to show how certain actions can make a group of people better off or worse off, even if it doesn't make any specific individual any more worse off. For example, coming up with medical solutions to something like a broken leg, de dicto helps all patients suffering from a broken leg. It makes all patients with broken legs better off than they would have been, regardless of who those patients may be. However, Sam, a patient with a broken leg, broke his leg because he recklessly climbed a tree thinking he could get treatment if he fell and broke his leg. Since he wouldn't have climbed that tree without the treatment option, developing the treatment actually made Sam worse off. It de re harmed him, even as it helped him as a patient with a broken leg. Even if it can't be shown if an individual is actually de re harmed by the actions of another, it is still true that the actions might be unfair. This approach follows an edited version of John Rawls' Veil of Ignorance. From this, a few facts can be discerned. First of all, the generations would agree to maximize well-being without asking previous generations to sacrifice their own well-being for future people. Future generations would benefit from innovations of the past generations. This means that future people should be at a higher state of being naturally. As a result, it would be unjust for current generations to so lower the well-being of future people that they are at a lower state of well-being from current generations. Even if injustice is necessary for an individual's existence, the fact remains that by performing certain actions, it is possible to put future people in an unjust state. This means that individuals can be de dicto harmed by certain actions through a lowering of their well-being and put in a de re state of injustice that exists regardless of whether the individual was de re harmed or not by the actions creating that state. In other words, by not respecting the rights of future people, current people both make whomever the future people may be worse off than they could have been in a de dicto sense and leave them in an unjust condition. Although not a typical lawsuit, injustice or unfairness can be grounds upon which a lawsuit can be brought and won, even if technically the injustice didn't cause harm, such in cases of wages or discrimination. Finally, a third reason to believe that current generations have duties to future generations, despite the non-identity problem, comes from the variability of identity. Simply put, the non-identity problem only works if everyone in a future generation's identity changes depending on current actions. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say the government is considering a new policy that will lead to some nasty problems in the future. When they implement this policy, the identities of some people might change, but the identities of other people might not change because the causal chain leading to their birth remained the same. However, it is unclear whose identities were affected and whose weren't. It is better to assume that someone could be harmed and avoid the action than say that since it is possible no one will be harmed, we have no duty to avoid actions that will make things de dicto worse for future people. So what duties do we have? Duties are a type of obligation to perform a certain action, usually in conjunction with the existence of a certain right. In order to have a duty to perform an action, certain requirements must be fulfilled, at least according to Ernest Partridge. First of all, that action must be the most morally valuable of the available acts. The performer of the duty must know that the duty exists. They must be capable of acting on that duty, and they must be able to choose freely to act or not act as duty requires. In my paper, I expand on all of these requirements and apply them to current generations in order to discern what sorts of duties might be held for normal, everyday people, along with people in different sorts of situations, such as people with significantly higher incomes or lawmakers. For this presentation, however, I will be discussing the duty of government as introduced at the beginning of this presentation. So governments can easily be said to have some of the greatest power when it comes to benefiting or harming the interests of future people. They have more power than individuals and are granted the ability to regulate businesses that might need some encouragement to care for future people over profits. Still, there are a few facts about governmental duties to future generations that should be discussed. First of all, duties to future generations must be more morally valuable than conflicting duties. So this basically means that if the government is considering two actions that are both duties, it has more of a duty or only a duty to perform the most morally valuable one. For future generations, this means that the government might sometimes have to forgo a duty to, say, protect a certain resource for future people if current people will suffer or die without that resource. For example, a fresh water resource. You could save that for future people, or you could ship them to people who are thirsty. Secondly, the government must be capable of acting on duty, choosing freely whether or not to act as duty requires. These two are both pretty easily obtainable by governments. Governments definitely have the power to act in order to protect future people, and within the constraints of being a collective effort, are able to pass resolutions and laws that allow them to choose freely whether or not to act as duty requires. The hardest one for government, I think, is number 4. The performer of the duty must know that the duty exists. Why is this difficult? Well, the government, the performer of the duty, is made up of a collective of people, some of which might know that a duty to future people exists, others which might not know that the duty exists. If they don't know the duty exists, then we can't say they have really failed in their duty. They did not have that duty without knowledge. The government might not agree on whether or not they have a duty to protect the environment for future people, for example. However, I do believe there's one duty that everyone in the government can probably agree exists. So governments, or at least the U.S. government, has a duty to ensure the rights of its citizens. It might fail in this duty at times, but all citizens are afforded rights that are enforced under the law. However, some policies might cause the government to be unable to carry out its duty in the future. The government can't create a law, for example, stating that in 150 years free speech will be banned. It may not affect any currently living people, and there's a good chance that banning free speech in 150 years would change the identity of those born as people attempt to immigrate. But it still cannot do that because it would go against protecting the rights of future people, rights that do exist. Likewise, passing policies that damage the environment, as is being alleged in the aforementioned lawsuit, could make the government's ability to protect the rights of its citizens weaker. For example, it can be argued that reckless environmental policies impact the government's ability to ensure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by causing its citizens to live in an unsafe environment where their life is cut short by people who are long gone, their liberty is impacted by a loss of certain activities, and their pursuit of happiness is impacted by a lack of security. Even if certain people disagree as to what is owed to future people, it can at least be shown that the government definitely has a duty to protect the rights of all its citizens, even those yet to be born. And that is it. And
Okay, so now we have time for questions for Marisa.
Hi there. Yes, you.
So I do have a question about, I guess, if I had two, but if you could you clarify the original position that for the non-existent people? And then
The original position,
roles.
yeah, Rawls' Veil of Ignorance. So this came from a paper written by Trammell, and it basically stated, so in Rawls's original document, he sort of throws out the idea of different generations coming together because he thinks it's a little too far-fetched. But this guy alleges that it's not too far-fetched because it's a thought experiment. So he actually goes through and he does it as if basically as if Rawls hadn't thrown that out and what that would entail. And what he decides is he looks at a whole bunch of different options, like what if everyone had to stay at the same level of well-being, and as a result, nothing moves forward and it's not great. And so what he ends up concluding is that the best option, the most fair option, is for well-being to grow over time in order to maximize well-being. And the reason that this is fair is because previous generations innovate for themselves and future generations benefit from those innovations. As a result, future generations should be at a naturally higher state of well-being just by the merit of the fact that past generations have made improvements to their own lives. So it would be unjust in that case for one generation to do something like cause a nuclear apocalypse or cause some sort of horrible environmental damage that would cause future generations to be at a state of well-being equal or lower to the starting well-being of the previous generation. That's basically it. Yes.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
I was wondering, so the sort of Rawlsian solution to the non-identity problem, do you think that's totally separate from the sort of de dicto solution, so treating people as sort of collective categories? Because it sort of feels like it might need that to talk about the future generations. So I was just wondering about the relationship between those two.
I think that one can supplement the other. I actually cut out a slide that probably that was right in the middle of those two and might have helped to smooth things along a little bit. Basically, I point out that one of the problems with the de dicto, de re distinction is that although it works great for philosophy, it might not work so great for, say, a court of law where they want you to prove that you were harmed, despite the fact, the individual, was harmed in a more of a de re sense than a de dicto sense. So I felt that the Rawlsian injustice sort of supplemented and helped the case for future generations by saying that even if it's not wrong entirely because you specifically were harmed, by doing this you were still put in an unjust condition. And in that way, they have made you less well off in another sense. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Is it possible to like put too much emphasis on future generations, but like overlooking who you may have to people in the present?
Yes. That's why the first one you'll notice was it has to be the most morally valuable option, whatever duty you're doing. And in my paper, I talked more about this. If you have a duty to someone in a current generation versus a duty in a future generation, current generational issues will likely always come first because that's right now, that's happening immediately. And if we focus only on solving problems for future people, we forget that we need to solve problems right now. Future people can wait. They're not here yet. We can solve problems now and also fix consequences of, say, certain actions before future people actually get here. Yeah, you also have. Okay.
I was just wondering your thoughts. You did mention government is just a collective of people, just a group of people.
Yeah, it's.
And it says, what would you say? Government has a duty, has to know it has a duty, right?
Yeah.
But people elect, let's just not talk about appointed people, but elected officials. What if the people who elected those people don't know they have a duty? Do those elected officials have a duty to basically go against, say, their constituents? Their constituents think, well, no, we don't have an obligation to future generations. But the elected official themselves might know, we do have a duty. Is it okay to, who is their duty to, in a sense, future or their constituents? I mean, it's just if you have a...
That's actually something I didn't consider. That's very interesting. I kind of want to say both, but I feel like, if it's really like conflicting, I think that I do talk about in my paper more, and I ended up having to cut this for time, a duty to educate for the knowledge part. For example, if you know that you have a duty to future generations, you'll have to educate yourself on like what you can do. And so I think that in a case like that, I think a good compromise might be something along the lines of a duty to educate. You go and you represent, but you also make sure that you go back and you still try to educate your constituents a little bit.
I agree with you.
For us to do this duty correctly for the future generation, should we try to be better environmentally or socially or both? Like, should we try to have more conservation, like on an environmental scale? Like, should we try to go greener? Or socially, should we keep going the way we are going? Like allowing people like gay, trans, lesbian rights, allow them to have even more equal rights that we have, or like religious rights, like to make sure that all of those are equal and all those voices are being heard. Do you think that both we have like an environmental and a social obligation to the future generations, or what's your focus?
I'd like to say that we have a duty towards both, but focusing on Joel Feinberg's interests, it is true that we don't know entirely what future people's interests will be. But what we can do is ensure that they will have the interests that we know. So, like, I think making sure that socially future people will have like all the human rights that we believe every human being deserves. Ensuring things like people will have access to food and water resources, and that they won't have to suffer in this way, because we know that they're going to have those interests, because we have those interests. And even if future people, I don't know, are half cyborgs, you're still gonna have to eat and drink and everything else that we do.
I'm going to go back to the criteria that you have to know that the duty exists to be responsible for it.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like a pretty strong criteria.
Yeah,
Because what if I don't want to have a lot of duties, so I just like avoid ethical knowledge as much as I can, and then take a philosophy class, like, that's like a get out of jail card?
No, but you know that you have that you're avoiding those
But I don't
duties.
know any of the actual duties.
But you don't know the duties, but you know that you have a duty to educate yourself.
Okay,
maybe.
Did I answer that question?
I don't know. Well, I guess if you don't even, but if you know that duties exist, but you avoid them,
I know
so
that
that
was
you
some.
don't have to know that there are duties,
Yeah.
I feel like then you have to. It's kind of a sketchy way. I feel like you have to, if you know that duties do exist, but you're avoiding knowing about them, then I think you might have a duty to learn about them.
So maybe you could reframe that rule. It's
Yeah.
not that you have to know about the duty, that you should have known, or something like that. Like there was enough information that if you had done your, if you were a responsible moral agent, you would know that that was, but that might be a sort of tweak version.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.